Well, welcome everybody to this Facebook Live broadcast where we explore the intersection between Christianity and science. My name is Dr. Fuz Rana. I am a biochemist, a Christian apologist, and I also am the Vice President of Research and Apologetics for an organization called Reasons to Believe. So if you're interested in learning more about the resources that we have at Reasons to Believe that can assist you as you explore the interface between Christianity and science, please go to our website, www.reasons.org. Today, we're going to take on the question, if God is responsible for the universe, for everything that we see, how is it possible to detect design in a world where everything is designed? Believe it or not, this is a rather common objection to the design argument. And so we're going to tackle that question today. But before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping just to get things going this afternoon. First of all, if you are watching this broadcast, would you please do me a favor? Go to the comment section and let me know who you are and where you're watching from. Whether you're watching this broadcast live or watching a recorded version of the broadcast, this is really very helpful information for us to have as we plan future broadcasts. On top of that, the more interactions that we have with the Facebook Live feed, the greater the visibility the broadcast gets in the Facebook platform. And then finally, I really want you to again, let me know who you are, to let me know again where you're watching from, because it's a way for me to get to know you, because I really want to make sure that we are getting to know one another, even if it is virtually through these broadcasts. Also, I'd love for you to use the comment section to offer your perspective, your thoughts on this question. Even if your perspective differs from mine, I want to create an environment where we can have civil conversation about really very important questions that ultimately relate to whether or not a creator exists and the Old and the New Testament found in the Judeo-Christian scriptures is reliable. And then last but not least, if you've got a suggestion for a topic or a question that you would like me to address in a future broadcast, please, again, use the comment section to communicate that information to me. Okay, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at today's question. And what I'd like to do before I respond to the question is really set the stage for you so you understand the context in which this question was asked. Last week at Reasons to Believe, we inaugurated a brand new ministry program called RTB Live, where we use technology to broadcast talks that we would give presenting a scientific case for the Christian faith, followed by a time of Q&A. And this broadcast is available through our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1. And the idea is that every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 in the afternoon, if you're in the Eastern time zone, one of the members of the scholar team will again broadcast live a presentation, followed by a time where you can interact through Q&A. And the broadcast last week was entitled Creating Life in the Lab. It was the inaugural broadcast. I had the honor and the privilege to launch this program. And the point of the presentation was to show how work in synthetic biology actually can be used to make a case for a creator's existence and necessary role in the origin and the basic design of life. Synthetic biology, if you're not familiar with that area of science, involves an amalgam of biology and engineering, where the goal on the part of researchers is to create artificial, non-natural life forms that can be used for technology purposes. But as part of this endeavor, researchers are trying to create what are called protocells, chemical super systems that have the properties of life, or that begin to assume the properties of life. These systems are created by assembling smaller building block materials, again, into these entities that begin to adopt the properties of cellular life. And work in this area actually gives us insight into the origin and the design of life. Specifically, I made the argument that work in synthetic biology helps us to make an empirical argument for God's existence, again, and role in the origin of life. Why? Because work that's being done to create protocells consistently, time and time again, demonstrates the essential necessary role of intelligent agents in transforming molecules into the very first cellular entities. The researchers that are doing this work are the best minds in the world that are relying on a couple of hundred years of accumulated scientific knowledge. And they use that knowledge and their brilliance to develop these elaborate and sophisticated strategies to convert molecules into protocellular entities. And these strategies are ingenious, they are incredibly clever and insightful, and yet they require the strategies then to be broken down into these sophisticated protocols that require highly skilled, knowledgeable researchers in a laboratory setting to execute them, where these researchers have to work under precise conditions, under highly controlled conditions. In other words, intelligent agency is indispensable in the process of converting molecules into cellular entities. And so for me, this represents an empirical argument for design. Now, as part of my presentation, I also talked about work in prebiotic chemistry that essentially points us to the same conclusion, that as researchers try to recapitulate the different steps required for the origin of life, inevitably the role of the researcher becomes indispensable in affecting transformations in the laboratory that in principle would be required to contribute to the origin of life process. So after presenting this argument, and again, if you're interested, the title of the talk is Creating Life in the Lab, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1. But after presenting this argument, during the Q&A, somebody by the name of Splodin asked the question, well, how can you actually detect design in nature? And so this is a common question. And for many people, the view is that intelligent design or creation is outside the bounds of science. That it really is a philosophical or religious program. It's not a scientific program. And therefore, design detection really is not appropriately part of science. But in response to Splodin, I pointed out that there are actually disciplines within science that are intelligent design programs that are predicated on the ability of science having the tools to detect the work of intelligent agency in nature. SETI is a prime example, where researchers are trying to determine whether electromagnetic radiation emanating from a distant object is due to natural processes or to the signaling of an advanced civilization. Or if you go to archaeology, archaeologists are able to pick up rocks and examine them and determine whether those rocks are produced through natural process mechanisms or whether they were shaped by the work of an intelligent agency. And so the point here is that design is very much part of the scientific enterprise, and that science has the toolkit available to it to detect design. And so what is it exactly that SETI or archaeologists are doing? Well, as we turn to their work and evaluate how they determine design in nature, we can use that insight to build our case for a creator's role in the design of the universe and phenomena in the universe, such as life. So for example, a number of years ago, Seth Shostak, who is a researcher at SETI, at the SETI Institute, wrote an article where he argued that what SETI is doing when they detect the work of intelligent agency is looking for features in electromagnetic radiation that reflect artificiality. In other words, he's arguing that there's certain features or signatures you would see in electromagnetic radiation that you would not expect if they emanated from a natural process source. that if intelligent agency is involved, there should be something that, again, appears to be artificial in that signal. If you look at the work of archaeologists, they do the same thing, where they look for certain features in an archaeological site or look for certain features in a rock that to them appear to be artificial, that appear to be intentionally designed, if you will. And then in both the case of SETI and in the case of archaeology, you try to rule out as best as you can any kind of plausible natural process explanation for those features that you are attributing to the work of a designer. And then in the case of archaeology, you really can't do this in the case of SETI, but you can do this in the case of archaeology. You can actually go into the lab, and then you can try to recapitulate the production of that particular feature to look and see what is actually required to produce a feature like that. And so when I've presented a case for design in nature, I've actually employed this very line of reasoning, where, for example, in my book, The Cell's Design, I talk about how biochemical systems display a sense of artificiality, where we see the designs in biochemical systems displaying eerie similarities to the designs produced by human beings. And that similarity, that similarity, in a sense, connotes an artificiality. In the book Origins of Life, Hugh Ross, an astronomer, and I argue that every plausible scenario for the origin of life simply falls short. So we are ruling out natural process mechanisms for the design that we see in biochemical systems. And the talk that I gave last week and in my book, Creating Life in the Lab, I argue that in order to create life in a laboratory setting, it requires the work of intelligent agency. Intelligent agency plays an indispensable role to produce the types of features that are characteristic of living systems. So in a sense, in these three books, we see essentially that approach being used to detect design in nature, with the conclusion a creator exists and is responsible for the origin and the design of life. Last week when I presented the RTB Live presentation, I was focusing on, in effect, the second and the third criteria, the idea that chemical evolution can't account for the origin of life, and that work in synthetic biology shows us, again, intelligent agency is necessary. Where we didn't really explore the first criteria, namely the artificiality of the cell's chemical systems. But nevertheless, the point here is that intelligent design can indeed be part of the construct of science, and that to conclude that there are features in the living realm that relate to the origin and the design of life, to conclude that this is the work of an intelligent agent, the work of a designer, is actually a scientific conclusion, not a theological or philosophical conclusion. Now, this is where the question from Splodin comes into play. And let me read the question to you, because he posed this question after we ended the Q&A session in the comments of the RTB Live video feed. He said this: "Thank you, Dr. Rana, for addressing one of my questions, namely, how does one tell something has been designed from something that has not been designed? Here's the real thrust of the question, though. You believe everything is designed, so how could you have anything non-designed in which to compare something that you believe has been designed in order to demonstrate design?" In other words, if I believe, like many people who hold my perspective, that the entire universe is the product of a designer, of a creator, that in effect, everything in the universe really should be designed. But if that's the case, then how can you argue that you can detect design in a backdrop where everything is designed? In other words, you need something that's not designed in order to determine that something is actually designed. This is a really very good question that Splodin is raising. And again, it's a common objection that I see to the design argument. So it's well worth addressing. Now, shortly after Splodin posed his question, my friend Agrippa, who is a skeptic who interacts with me quite a bit on Twitter, said this: if everything has been designed, it is unfalsifiable and therefore does not fit into the scientific methodology. More smoke and mirror apologetics. So let's go ahead and take on these two questions. And the first point that I want to make is that I can address Sploden's question both scientifically as well as theologically. So I'm first going to address the question scientifically, then we'll take a look at the question from a theological perspective. But to me, I think there is a bit of a false dilemma here that Sploden is posing, and that is the dilemma isn't between design and non-design, but it's between something that is designed through the direct interaction of an intelligent agent and something that is the product of natural processes. So you could have a universe that a creator put into place where there are features in the universe that reflect the direct involvement of the creator. And then there's also going to be features in the universe that reflect the outworkings of natural processes that creator created or ordained. And so the comparison is not between design and non-design, but design and the outworkings of natural process mechanisms. So for example, if we go to William Paley and his watchmaker argument, what Paley was doing when he laid out the watchmaker argument was he basically compared a watch, which is clearly something produced by an intelligent agent, by a watchmaker, with a rock that was produced through the outworkings of natural processes. So Paley's comparison is not between design and non-design, but design and the outworking of natural processes, with the idea that if you can show that there are features in nature that are clearly the handiwork of an intelligent agent, then by implication, everything that you see in the creation then must be the product of a designer, whether that design is direct, as in the case of a watch, or indirect, as in the case of a rock. Now, more recently, Bill Dembski, a design theorist, proposed this idea of an explanatory filter, where he was trying to get at essentially the question that Sploden addresses, which is, how do you detect if something is designed in nature? And so in this filter, Dembski basically poses a series of three questions that are part of a flow chart. The first question is, can this phenomena that we're looking at be explained through the outworking of natural law? In other words, is it a necessity? If the answer is yes, then it's not designed. If the answer is no, then you go down to the next stage in the flow chart and ask the question, is it the outworking of chance processes? If the answer is yes, then it's not designed. If the answer is no, you go down to the final step and ask the question, does this display specified complexity, which is Dembski's term for artificiality, if you will, to use Seth Shostak's language. And if the answer is yes, then you conclude that the system is designed. So in other words, what Dembski is comparing is not design with non-design, but design with the outworking of either natural law, necessity, or the outworkings of natural processes that have chance outcomes. And so the comparison, again, is not design or non-design, but design versus natural processes. So in this sense, I don't think that that Sploden's objection actually stands up to careful consideration, though I very much appreciate the point that he's making. Now, with regard to Agrippa's question, I think in a sense the idea of falsifiability doesn't really apply, simply because when you're looking for design in nature, it's design detection that you are pursuing. This is not a question of falsifiability, but rather it's a question, is something designed or is it not designed? Those are really the two options. And can you build a case for design, again, using rigorous criteria? And I think the answer is yes, if we follow in the footsteps of what people who work at SETI or what archaeologists do. Okay, now Let's take a look at this question from a theological standpoint. Because again, I take the view that the universe and everything within the universe is ultimately the product of a creator's handiwork. But if, for example, we look in the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts, we note that in these creation accounts, that different verbs are used to refer to a creator's activity. That the creator brings about his creative purposes in a variety of ways, in a variety of modes, through a variety of means. So, for example, we see the word bara, which means to originate something that has never existed before. Or we see the words asa, yatsar, and bana, which all imply God creating something new out of pre-existing material that he intervenes and fabricates into something new. In all four of these cases, the implication is that God is directly involved in this activity. And so we would expect that bara, asa, yatsar, and bana creations should bear divine fingerprints, should be clearly displaying the types of features that would lead someone to conclude that a watch is the product of a watchmaker, that these features of nature should display artificiality and reflect, again, the work of an intelligent agent who was directly involved in their creation or their fabrication. Now, there's other verbs in Genesis 1 and 2 that are used, haya, dasha, which seem to imply that God is creating through natural processes. That part of the creation is indeed something that reflects God's handiwork, but indirectly, where the creation is now indirectly achieved through the processes that God has created and that God has ordained. Now, it's not to say that we can't detect evidence in the laws of nature or in the other processes that God has ordained for a creator's handiwork. So, for example, if we think about the anthropic principle in cosmology, the idea that the universe appears to be designed for a purpose because of the fine-tuning of the constants of nature, this is an example of essentially evidence for God even designing the laws and the processes that govern the universe. Because many of the constants of nature essentially are constants that are intimately connected with the way the laws of nature operate. And so we see within the constants that define the laws of nature, again, evidence for a creator's fingerprint. And so we see even evidence for a creator's fingerprint in the laws and in the processes that God has ordained. But again, something that is the product or the outworking of the laws of nature or through chance processes that God has ordained are going to have very different types of signatures than products or phenomena within the creation that reflect God's direct personal involvement. Now, there's another theological point that we also need to make here as well, and that is this, that we also need to distinguish between creation and providence. That creation is God's work in originating something within the creation, whereas providence refers in part to the fact that God has put in place laws, that God has put in place processes that allow for the creation to operate essentially without God's direct involvement, without God's direct without God directly superintending the processes of nature. And so when we engage in much of scientific work, we're studying actually phenomena within the creation that reflect God's providence. And again, we're going to see design in the elegance and the sophistication of the processes themselves that, again, seem to suggest there was a fitness to purpose to the universe, but we don't necessarily see in their outcomes necessarily direct evidence for a creator's fingerprint. So when we think about, again, the nature of how God brings about his creative purposes through directly intervening and through the processes that he has ordained, when we think about the difference between creation and providence, we begin to see that, again, that it is appropriate to think about intelligent design or design and in comparison to natural processes as opposed to design and non-design. So in other words, you can at the same time hold the view that everything that we see is a product of a creator's handiwork, and at the same time detect design from non-design, with the idea that if, again, we see very clear signatures for design in phenomena in nature, then it gives us reason to think that not only was a creator involved in that particular aspect of creation, but that a creator played a role in the totality of creation. And that's essentially the point that I was trying to make on Thursday through the work in synthetic biology, that this idea that there is a mind behind the universe is an idea that can be tested with scientific rigor, and it is an idea that is not incoherent, but rather is coherent, where again we can coherently hold to the view that a creator is responsible with everything, and at the same time detect clear evidence for a creator's handiwork and a creator's fingerprints within the created order. Well, I hope that was helpful, Splodin, and I hope that was helpful, Agrippa. As I said, I would be curious in your responses to my answer to your questions. I appreciate the questions very much. And I'm interested in you who are watching this program too, what you think about this question that Splodin asked, the question that Agrippa asked. So please put your thoughts in the comment section. Also, if you have a suggestion for what we can talk about next week or in future episodes, please pose your question or suggest your topic in the comment section. And then last but not least, please take a moment to check in to let me know who you are, where you're watching from. Say hi to me. I really want to get to know you better. I'm going to go ahead and close this time together with this thought, and that is this, that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe and reasons to hope in this very difficult time that our country is facing. So I just pray that all of you can experience God's presence through this difficult time. I pray that all of you remain safe and healthy. And until next time, hang tough. I'll see you later.